Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and I'm wondering if the money that the Disney Corporation has made from that new musical featuring Elsa and Anna should be described as frozen assets. Well, moving swiftly on, let's talk about something very different. And we're going to be returning to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and the third of three conversations that I had with Mike Shapiro about some of the shows that we saw there this year in 2022. These were shows that we saw together or, on some occasions, separately, but shows that we very much enjoyed, which we thought were really worth talking about. They had something that we wanted to talk about here on Musical Talk, and today you'll get the chance to hear us doing so. But what are these wonderful shows, I hear you asking, because of my incredibly acute hearing? And the answer, of course, is as follows. And this, ladies and gentlemen, takes the form of a list. We're going to be talking today about Runesical, the RuneScape musical. We're going to touch on the Queens Cartoonists. We're going to talk about Serva Padrona and the shows Out to Lunch and Julie. And in the course of today's conversation, you will hear one of those shows described as, and I quote, the crotchety uncle of musical theatre. So keep your ears pinned back for that. And if you don't have a pin, you can tie them round the back. Well, we've got a lot to get through today, and frankly, the bit that follows me speaking to introduce the episode is always much more fun than this kind of old waffle. Let's cut this bit a bit short and move straight on to the bread and butter. I must be hungry, I keep talking about food. So, let's get on with today's episode and listen to Michael Gordon-Shapiro and me talking about those 5 fascinating shows that you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Mike, they say good things come in threes, and I think they must be right, because this is our third conversation, sort of mopping up all the wonderful things we saw at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. But for me, it means that I have had a hat-trick of enjoyable conversations with you, Mike, and I can tell you that I really, every time, whether it be virtual or in person, and luckily today it's in person, enjoy our conversations, because you bring insights to things which I simply don't see.
You're very kind. I think our equivalent expression would be to say it's a trifecta.
Oh.
Yeah. But
that sounds like an absolutely glorious pudding with lots of ice cream on it.
I think it's a racing term, but I don't partake, so this is a secondhand colloquialism. But yeah, it's been a real blast. And of course, this is our reunion after a couple of years doing remote shows, so it's been gratifying on that level as well.
It has. It was lovely seeing you in Edinburgh. It was lovely going to see some shows with you in Edinburgh. And of course, it's great talking about it with you face-to-face here in London afterwards about those wonderful things. But let's talk about a couple of shows that we actually did see. Well, the first one we both saw but we didn't see together, and the second one we did see together. And this first show is Runesical. Now, Runesical is about an online game. But for me, the attraction, because I know nothing about this game and I'm not part of the gaming community online in any way, but, of course, it's from the people behind Timson the musical, which we both saw in virtual form and discussed and really liked. And so I think we were both excited to see that they had a new musical coming up to Edinburgh this year. But I think you have a greater connection with online games. So how well do you know RuneScape, which is the game from which this comes, and if not, how the tropes of the gaming community allow you to enjoy this show in a way more, I suspect, than I, as a lay person, a walk-up punter with no background knowledge, was able to get from it?
So imagine a couple of concentric circles, and the innermost concentric circle is the group of people who have actually played the game RuneScape. I'm not in that circle, but the slightly wider circle is a group of people who have played similar fantasy role-playing video games, and I'm definitely in that circle. I have many years' experience in that genre. And outside of that circle, you have people who are not necessarily gamers or maybe casual gamers. And I think this show was entertaining for all of them. There were probably some inside jokes that the dedicated RuneScape players were more perceptive of, and I was kind of in this in-between category where I got the general gist of the tropes and references. But the basic idea is it simultaneously follows an in-game experience in one of these fantasy worlds, as well as kind of recurring framing device, the experience of the real-life human being who's playing this game.
Yes.
Who has a kind of story and progression of his own or of their own, because there are seemingly a couple of such people. So there's an inner story and an outer story, which is something that's common. This is like Timpson, which we saw last year, is the result of a very polished, very talented comedic troupe, and they obviously have experience working together. Their comedic timing is impeccable. There's a kind of rambunctious joy throughout the whole thing.
I think the writing partnership are called Sam and Alex. I can't remember their surnames. Yes, and they also improvise together.
Right, and that's clear. There's obviously a rolling with the punches. And there's also a improvisatory / interactive element to the show, where there are choice points throughout this adventure, and the audience is allowed to choose between one path or another. Or in some cases, they're allowed to make some sort of numerical decision. Sometimes this is unmasked through an applausometer, and sometimes they'll call somebody from the audience down to the stage to make some kind of decision or contribution. This is what I call non-traumatic audience participation, because nobody's really made fun of in a mean-spirited way, and I think even the most shy introverts like myself don't feel threatened by the level of participation that was going on.
And some of it was very well crafted as well. There was a lovely moment where, quite early on, which I think is one of those moments where actually the license is given to the audience. The audience suddenly realise they're allowed to do this, and they're not going to be sort of attacked or made to join in any way other than a pleasant, positive way, which is that one of the characters had to choose what colour hat they wanted. And the thing that was interesting to me immediately, and it made me think, was the 3 colour hats on offer were yellow, orange and purple. And those are unusual colours. Now, obviously, at one wacky level, why would you just go for the plain old colours? But of course, it makes you think. So you think, why are they doing that? Is it just for comic effect? Because somehow those colours, orange, purple and yellow seem funnier than blue, green and red. But of course, once a decision had been made using the audience clapometer concept, I think in this case, it's then referenced in one of the songs. But of course, the scansion of the song requires a 2-syllable word, and it suddenly becomes apparent. So it doesn't change the meaning of the song, but it just means that the actors on the stage on this occasion are singing about, our hero who's wearing the purple hat. But it could easily be our hero who's wearing the orange hat.
Right.
It fits in a way that it wouldn't have done if it was a single syllable or something like that. And so it doesn't make any difference, but it's super clever and really pays off for an audience member. So I, as an audience member, was thinking, they've referenced the colour of the hat. They must therefore have worked out lots of different versions of this song. And it's only later on you think, oh no, they're just inserting it within the text and it's not plot germane. But that's clever. I like that kind of thing. That's an easy win. It did lots of things. It allowed the audience to feel more comfortable. It showed that the song was tailored. It showed that the show, therefore, was tailored. And it gave us that interaction in a sort of nice, non-painful kind of a way, without actually, presumably there's a structure of this story which rumbles on in whichever version is made. So the basics are there, and then there's a couple of deviations here and there. Some are bigger, I think, than this tiny little wordplay, but I like picking up on this because I think this is a clever way of, some thought had gone into it.
And often the specifics of the experience you have, to some extent, can change. I think there's some pathways that might result in different songs, or perhaps different people singing the same song. Both of us have only seen the show once, so we can only compare and contrast our respective experiences.
And I think we both went on separate days, as you say, where they decided to go through the deepest, darkest dungeons rather than over the highest mountain. And therefore we got the song which I enjoyed the best, which was Freaky Troll, sung by the performer known as Alex, who's also the keyboard player, I think, for most of the show. I really liked Freaky Troll, and the way I remember it is a kind of sort of, once again, fun enough, not unlike something from Timpson in the sense that it had all that sort of funky 70s beat going on, which I somehow find instantly funny. You hear a 70s sort of funky beat, lots of bass chords and things like that. And it works in the context of a 70s thing. When you take it out immediately, for some reason, it's a sound I really love, and yet it's also instantly hilarious, or so it seems to me. So I really like that song. It stood out above all the rest of the score for me in particular, just because for some reason I had those resonance with the way it was sounding. Almost more than the lyrics.
I think what you're saying is you liked the music.
I did like the music.
Right.
Yes. That is what I am
translate. It was fun. It was very much a kind of a Rick James self-introductory thing, and the troll had like light-up glasses that were kind of suggestive of some of the more eccentric acts of the funk era. You know, like the Sun Ra types that are sort of gleefully over the top. And that the song was like that, the character was like that. It was just a good time for everyone.
Now, there were also several things which I think that you can recognise the flavours of from Timpson. You observed that there were some returning characters.
I'm going to invent this name. I don't know if this is the name of the characters, but I call them the Bad Advice Fishermen.
Yes.
were two kind of throwbacks. They might have seemed a little random if you hadn't seen Timpson, but if you did see that show, you'd recognize them as being brought back. It's interesting to compare and contrast the two, because they did share a kind of spirit of fun and approaching a mythological kind of subject or quasi-historical subject and adding irreverence and contemporary music. And there was elements of improv to both. And, you know, improv performers just tend to be so much fun because they can roll with any situation and make it enjoyable. But I think there was a way, even though this was a less polished production technically.
Slightly lower budget value.
Lower budget, right. There's a way that I liked this better. And it's, if I remember, it's been so long, but what I said about Timpson at the time is it felt like a showcase for the comedic talents of the cast. You had these episodes, and all of them allowed a cast member to step into the spotlight and be very funny, and it worked on that level. But it worked less well as a narrative. It was harder to pick a character and sympathize with that character and ride the wave of their experience to the end.
Yeah.
Whereas this show did have a central character, and it did have an emotional journey with sincere touch points. I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm going to have to be frustratingly vague, but there are character relationships that grow, and they're very down-to-earth and relatable in contrast to the sort of fantasy, sword and sorcery, ostensive setting of the show. The kind of IRL meta story about the gamer and what the relationships the gamer is navigating, and the question of who in this game is a real player and who's an NPC. There's a sincere core story. And I've always said, if you've got that sincere core story, you can absorb a lot of fun and silliness and digressions and parody and improv and still feel like it's a musical and not just a parody of a musical.
Yes, it validates parody, doesn't it? In fact, it brings the sincerity which might not be intrinsically in the piece if you weren't able to add these extra layers.
Well, I was going to say that when I think of parody, you know, I'll sometimes say parody-like to denote a kind of humor, but I think of true parody as something that exists to point out the foibles of something, and therefore cannot be an emotional journey of a sincere protagonist. To my mind, there's a real distinction between like a parody in that something making fun of something else, and a story that has kind of a reverent referential humor, which is sort of parody-ish, but doesn't have that slightly meaner spiritedness that I find in parody.
Yes, I understand exactly what you're saying there, and this managed it by having an overlay, which of course Timpson didn't. And once again, it's the overlay, isn't it, of a real situation, which is, without going too much into it, you know, the player, who is our avatar as an audience, ironically. You know, we latch onto him in this case as the main person entering the world, and therefore is the person that we enter the world with. But of course, every now and then, for comic effect, he's pulled back into his own life. You know, there's a lot of "I'm in my room, leave me alone" kind of thing, you know, teenage boy stuff almost. But actually, then they were able to expand that element. So, funny enough, you started this conversation by talking about two concentric circles. And I think what we've got here is the Venn diagram, essentially, of the outer circle representing... Well, you can cut your cake either way, but I suppose the outer circle is real life, and then within this man's real life is the RuneScape environment that we're sort of all moved into and then get to play with alongside him. But as I say, every now and then he comes out of that inner circle, which is in his life, back into the wider life that we're seeing. And therefore character connection in a sincere way, although still comically, can take place. So yes, you're right, it has a sincerity and it has a heart, which Timpson, being a pure fun time musical, misses out. But there are some flavours which I think really take you back into the Giggle Mug, because that's the name of their company, way of doing things, which Timpson sort of personified in an untempered way. So And what they're very good at, the whole thing about Timpson was an imaginary creation of how the Timpson Company came to be, completely unbased on any truth. There's a song in RuneScape, the musical, or Runesical as I should call it, where they talk about how RuneScape was invented. And they come up with this rather splendid conceit of looking at the word RuneScape and saying, no, it's not RuneScape at all. The creation is based on run escape, which of course is a perfectly valid way of reading that word, which doesn't actually mean anything. And then they sort of spin off onto the creation of the piece from this palpably false position.
Right.
And it is because we all know it's palpably false that we can enjoy it so much. We're now going to lie to you and invite you to join us on this journey happily about how RuneScape came to be, is basically how that song works. And yet it does work. I find that quite interesting. That's a very interesting comic journey, to bring people with you very knowingly, with the wink, into nonsense, which essentially cannot further the story in any way, because it is just a kind of sort of artificial, here's how it came to be. It's in the ragbag end of the musical. There's a plot, but there's also stuff just for fun. And sometimes that can really lag or drag or sag. But on this occasion, it did none of the three.
I agree. It managed to, I think, perhaps more perfectly than Timpson did in prior years, combine the lightheartedness, not taking things too seriously, digressionary quality, right, where you can go on a kind of a tangent you associate with improv and perhaps with parodies, with the more traditional character-centric, sincere journey of a protagonist paradigm that musical theater does when it's at its best. Another element of this that I wanted to call out for celebration was the talent of the cast. And we've in these three conversations we've talked about cases where cast members are musicians and vice versa. And this is another case where there's a fluid role swapping where people who are ostensibly band members are called out for solo numbers. And amazingly, actors can take over the roles of musicians when a musician is called into the limelight to be a foreground character. And it's done so well that you don't really notice unless you're paying attention to it.
You're right, sleight of hand in that sense, isn't it? Absolutely, it's so smooth.
Very much so, yeah.
But funny enough, that's hidden craft, once again, oddly. That's directorial, I would have said, but it must be in the writing too. But, directorially to smooth those edges so actually the whole thing flows and, the eye is led in one direction and you don't really spot the transition from actor to musician and vice versa.
I'm reminded a little bit of the practices of the percussion section of orchestras, particularly when you have multiple percussionists and they're swapping between many different instruments. And these swaps are rehearsed so well that during the course of a piece, something large like a Mahler symphony, you see that if you look at these percussionists...
A piece of Mahler? Sorry.
Piece of Mahler. They're fluidly moving back and forth between stations at which are arrayed a number of instruments, and they'll just cross each other and they'll pick up instruments and put them down and do it all in time for a cue at a given measure. And this struck me as being reminiscent of that. And I wouldn't want to divert anyone from enjoying the show to notice that detail, but there was so much skill that I thought it was worth mentioning.
I'm going to go off on a tiny little tangent then, if I may, because I saw a show which wasn't in itself a musical, but is in the wider family of musical theatre performance, which was called the Queens Cartoonists. Now, they're a jazz band, essentially, and they specialise... They come from Queens in New York, in case you're wondering.
Hence the name.
Yes, and they're called the Cartoonists because they take cartoons and animated features, both well-known and less well-known, and they substitute live music for the recorded soundtrack. And quite a lot of these soundtracks for classic cartoons are terribly complicated, complex, funny, unusual, and yet orchestral as well. There's a very famous clip on YouTube from one of the proms, actually, from a few years ago, and it's well worth watching, of John Wilson conducting, I think, the London Symphony Orchestra, playing a Scott Bradley composed 7-minute score to a classic Tom and Jerry cartoon, complete with yelps and screams and percussion. So there's a percussion unit throwing things into a bin to make the sound of cacophony and things like that. But you can also see the great thing about it, apart from the fact it's fabulous, is that you can see all the musicians in the orchestra are really enjoying themselves. So with the Queen's Cartoonists, I was very delighted because they're doing the same thing, slightly lower key. They're not the LSO, there's not 50 of them, there's 5 or 6. But they are the victims of their own success, because we went into the auditorium, the Assembly Roxy, and there's a screen behind them, And onto the screen goes the cartoon with the soundtrack missing, and then the orchestra, the band, the cartoonists are playing. The problem is, you're watching the film. You're just automatically, your eye is diverted to the moving picture, which I think is very much 21st century living, and probably most of the 20th century as well. If there's a moving screen in your room, you look at it. And so the actors, or the performers rather, are on the stage playing magnificently and comedically and with actions, because when you do cast your eye to them, they're moving around, they're living the music they're playing. They've got 5 or 6 different instruments. They might have different things hanging from their belts as well, like a kazoo and a various bit of percussion where you just go noise when that's needed as well. So they're providing their own sound effects.
That's called a musical saw. That instrument.
Oh, is it? In fact,
it's kind of a sheet of metal that you can wave or hit with something.
I'm delighted that you were able to identify it from just the description of the noise I made, so thank you very much indeed. Well, there could be a parlour game in this. But the problem is that they are basically doing what I would describe as Spike Jones and his City Slickers kind of improvised live one-take jazz comedy, and we, the audience, are looking at what Popeye's doing on the screen 6 feet above them, or whatever. And it's such a shame in a way, but actually their unique selling point also deprives you, the audience, from actually seeing them doing what they're doing. I think at the Royal Albert Hall, where the problem was, you could see both the cartoon and the orchestra enjoying themselves, so they're all in the scope of vision. But in a smaller, more intimate Edinburgh venue, that's much harder to achieve. Anyway, that's a side point, but it takes us back to what you were saying about
musicianship skill and difficulty of appreciating it when you're focusing on the main show.
Yes, exactly. When you're chasing a narrative, it's hard to see some of the extras, actually. So maybe see the show twice, which is every show creator's dream.
Runesical lends itself to multiple viewings because of the choice point element, and the fact that you might see a meaningfully different show on multiple occasions.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Yes, if we'd have gone on another day, we probably would have got the high mountains rather than the deepest, darkest dungeon. Be very interested to see if Funky Troll was going to be up there, or we've got Angry Goat Herd instead, or something like that. So, on the whole, we thought Runesical was very good. As I say, as a non-gaming person, I enjoyed it for what it was and was able to pick up enough of it. I think you got more out of it than I did. Just because of that greater sort of contextual knowledge.
And literal RuneScape players, I think, would have a blast. So if you happen to be in that population, this is a must-see.
But let's move on to another show. I wouldn't say it was at all totally similar, and it's a show we did see together, but it does still have the conceit of somebody speech marks in real life, then going into, in this case, the musical they're putting on as part of it. And this is La Serva Padrona, with an old friend of this programme, David William Hughes, who's a magnificent man. He's a highly educated man who teaches and understands historic music, everything from the Elizabethan era onwards. His first show in Edinburgh was called Elizabethan, and he sang Elizabethan songs to a lute, including a falsetto when required, and we'll be getting back to the falsetto in a minute. In his second show, Wit and Mirth, it was songs taken from the songbook by Thomas Durfey, which was published in the very early part of the 18th century, so basically 17th century and early 18th century comic songs. And now he's in La Serva Padrona, which is a kind of pre-Mozartian, so that's going to be an 18th century, presumably, or very late 17th century one-piece comic opera filler originally. But the conceit of the show is, I think, half the fun. You get La Serva Padrona, the classical piece of music in its condensed form, and you get his story about how he gets to put it on. Would you care to describe that further?
Sure. So perhaps similarly to another show we've discussed, Don't Say Macbeth, you have a struggling production of some kind that is beset by outside forces making it difficult to produce. In this case, we are introduced to, I believe, the janitor of an opera company that, due to financial troubles, has been forced to lay off their orchestra and staff.
I.e., the entire company except him.
Except him. He is just keeping the lights on, and but he is this character, this janitor, is a deep believer in opera. And the premise is, because he doesn't want opera as an art form to be neglected due to financial downturns or to fade out of popular consciousness, he's a champion of opera, he's going to perform the opera for us as best as a single person can do. And this turns out to be surprisingly well, as he alternates between 3 or 4 principal characters.
There's 3 characters, but one is essentially mute, luckily.
Right, or there's a character who only appears in the second act as a figure in the story.
That's right. He's equivalent of an office boy. He's a servant who doesn't say anything, and then he's used by one of the characters to represent a different character. But so David is essentially singing the master of the house and his made, essentially.
Right. And the way he differentiates these characters is, I don't want to call them masks, but imagine a kind of an outer rim of a mask suggesting hair.
Or a mask with the middle taken away that you can put your face through.
Right. A giant donut, if you will.
Yes.
A donut of drama.
Or a beautifully drawn lavatory seat.
I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, it fits. So he sticks his head through these quasi-masks, and that lets us know what character he's playing. And of course, that's incredibly funny. He's actually a remarkably good singer. And that applies to both when he's doing the male part and when he switches to falsetto to do the female part. And when he's switching into female road with falsetto, he doesn't try to ham it up in a way that says, look how ridiculous it is that I'm singing to a radically different type. He plays it seriously, in as much as a comedy is serious. I should say he doesn't add to the comedy another level of meta-comedy. He plays it
like... The performance is serious within the comic context of the narrative.
Yes, thank you. And it's enjoyable both because you're getting the story in very condensed form, but you also get the enjoyment of seeing somebody who's so talented that they can actually sing these roles. And that's a kind of fun, almost like watching an Olympic athlete do their thing and just taking joy in the amount of skill. And I know you've interviewed him in past episodes of Musical Talk.
And I've got an interview coming up about La Serva Padrona. He's fabulous, David, yes.
Perfect. But I'd never seen him or experienced him firsthand, so it was a real joy just seeing the talent at work, but put into such a humble framework because he's portraying himself as a modest janitor who's just acting out of love of the art. So it's a fun story and fun framing device around the story.
One of the things I particularly like about the framing device is the fact that, funnily enough, it harkens back to the 1970s when ostensibly this opera company was worried about the Cold War destroying opera, or the Cold War perhaps destroying the world. So they come up with an opera, emergency opera kit, essentially, which is the conceit. So he finds it in his janitorial duties as caretaker. He finds this box in the basement, and then he decides to revive opera by using the equipment in this box, but it has all the hallmarks of the 70s. So there's a cassette player in it. Now, so we see him right at the beginning of the show with a cassette in his hand, and the cassette player is pulled out of this box and put on a shelf. Now, that immediately, cassettes is a dead form. Vinyls come back. I don't see cassettes ever coming back. But then what I love about it is he puts the cassette, not the conceit, listen to me. He puts the cassette into the cassette player to play the backing tracks, which he then sings to when he's performing the two singing roles in La Serva Padrona. And what's fabulous is they're sort of, and we've used the word before in some of our conversations, but funky 70s backing. And what I like is the fact that there is a comedy value in listening to 70s style orchestrations of Pergolese's original music for this early 17th or 18th century opera. And fun enough, I sort of really like it. And I think the reason I particularly like it is because I find it quite funny. Secondly, it's a nice clear orchestral backing, a simple clear orchestral backing for the words, which are all in English. Well, he starts off in Italian, but it says that I've only got enough Italian for the first song, which he sings with subtitles, if you remember rightly, on little sticks.
He's literally holding up cards that have the subtitles.
Yeah, and then he says the rest of it's in English, which is better. But I'm a child who remembers in the 1970s and 80s lots of easy listening albums of famous musicals or classical music played by the great sort of bands of the period or the orchestras of the period, Bert Kaempfert playing Offenbach classics in a really easy listening kind of a way. I've got that album at home, I think it is. And my favourite of this particular form is Edmundo Ross, who was a sort of British calypso band leader, playing beautiful orchestral renditions, easy listening orchestral renditions of the score of Hair. And I like Hair as a musical only because I like these Edmundo Ross versions, because they're really palatable. It's like the Beatles. You can translate the Beatles into easy listening, and they've had this parallel life to the sort of pop and rock world they also live in. Same through these LPs. So I was immediately transported back into... I could easily buy the idea that in 1974 this opera company had created then contemporary sounding backing tracks, which essentially you could have bought on an LP and you could still buy for £1 in a second-hand shop, bric-a-brac shop, today I should think. So it added extra level of comedy, and yet at the same time was a perfect bed for the music. It's not a million miles away from a version of La Serva Padrona which I saw in Edinburgh maybe about 10 years ago, which was called The Secretary Turned CEO, which was a contemporizing of the story in a kind of sort of small company, a luxury lavatory roll company, as it happens.
It's some humor right there.
Yeah, absolutely. But the wonderful thing about that was that the orchestrations were played both legitimately, as you might imagine them to be, on stringed instruments, but with an electric guitar overlay as well. So it gave you a modern flavour on top of the historic flavour, which was very palatable to my ear. This is, if you like, doing the same thing but in a totally different way. Instead of having a bit at both ends of the spectrum of time, it said, I'm only going to the middle of the spectrum of time and give us these funky 70 backings. Sorry, I've been banging on, but I liked the music.
I think a common element of all of what we described so far is a sense of an underdog, somebody who has very few resources and is doing their best to, without apology, convey this art form. So yes, the backing track should be an orchestra, but they sound like 16-bit chip tunes. But the same idea is that they're very kind of like backbeat driven, and they don't carry the dignity and weight of a traditional orchestral accompaniment. And doesn't that fit the character? Because he's a janitor working.
And he's wearing in dungarees all the way through as well. Yes.
Exactly. He's Mario-like, and he's got these little donut masks. So, but the fact that he remains steadfast in his sincere desire to share opera with us gives the show a heart and makes it not degenerate into kind of a self-ridicule.
Yes, I think that, yes, it's not. It's absurd, but it's not nastily ridiculous. Yes, it's not nasty in any way. I think it's a love song to opera, beautifully sung as it is in its own right by David. So that's La Serva Padrona, which is interesting to me that this odd one-act opera, comic opera filler from 300 years ago keeps coming back to the Edinburgh Fringe. And David told me in our interview that it has the distinction of being the oldest continually produced piece of opera in the canon. Whilst there's others which occasionally get, revived every 100 years, and stuff that's clearly older, but this just never gets picked up except by specialists. In terms of there's always somebody putting on La Serva Padrona somewhere.
So something in the story itself must resonate.
Also, it's cheap.
You don't have to pay the royalties.
Well, no royalties, and actually you still only need to pay 3 cast members, and one of those doesn't even need to sing.
All right, cast sizes are small, that's true. So it's chamber opera, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. I believe it was used to fill a gap in between longer operas for the people who didn't want to leave during the intervals. That's its history. And it's sort of pre-Mozartian, so Mozart then takes that form and turns it into the comic opera that we know, and then from his comic opera, you can see the succession all the way through to Offenbach, Gilbert and Sullivan, and then it sort of jumps the track a little bit and becomes Cohan and musical theatre, if you want to find that tracking.
So it really is opera filler.
Yeah, but it's also sort of got a claim to be the father of musical theatre, or the grandfather, or the great-grandfather,
or the crotchety uncle. Yeah.
Yes, the crotchety uncle of musical theatre there. What a beautiful phrase.
Under-celebrated.
I just want to mention a couple of shows. I sort of think in passing, we'll sort of gallop past these, but I think they're worth mentioning for one or two ideas. There was it was a play with songs called Out to Lunch. It was a 3-hander again, funnily enough, this time actually with 3 actors, about a restaurant critic who's actually not a terribly nice person, and how he's being surpassed in his career by other restaurateurs, so he wants to do something that's truly dramatic. And what he wants to do is give a review that's so bad of a restaurant that actually it provokes the restaurant owner to commit suicide, for which an award is given, believe it or not, within the community of restaurant in this figurative world, not in real life, figurative world of really nasty restaurant reviewers. He sees it as his only real way of making a name for himself. So you can tell immediately this is a dark, absurdist comedy. It's not sincere, although it's a touch satirical in one or two cases. We have had a few restaurant critics in this country whose reputations have not necessarily always been as the nicest person, and I can think of one who's no longer with us, whose name I'm not going to mention, but whose reputation has suffered very badly since he passed. But that's the conceit, and the 3 characters are the restaurateur, who is a terrible restaurateur, but is sort of sweet and naive, the critic himself, and the critic's agent. And there's this 3-way goes on for it's an hour-long show. It's very funny. It's not really a musical, but the reason I want to talk about it does have 3 or 4 songs in it, and there's one song which is fabulous. The plan backfires, and the rest of the restaurant critic community sort of turn on our, I'm going to say protagonist rather than hero, our anti-hero central character. And he is then denounced in the press by these restaurant critics, but also by the newspapers in general. So it becomes a news story, not just a story within the narrow confines of restaurant criticism. And so he dejectedly, he goes to his agent to be told the bad news because he's trying to save his career, because he thinks, so basically, and she sings this fabulous song where she goes through each of the newspapers to say what they call him. So it starts off with the big name newspapers in this country, the Telegraph, the Times, the Guardian. I think the Telegraph and the Times put the boot in, and he says, all right, that's okay, I can afford to lose them as long as I can start appealing to the liberal middle class, and I'll write for the Guardian. And then she carries on singing the song, the Guardian put the boot in. But the ridiculous nature of the song, the comic brilliance of this song is that it goes further and further and further into every publication that goes. So it moves out of the world of what I would call mainstream newspapers. It moves into the world of what might be called gossip magazines like OK and Hello and that kind of women's magazine, to use an old-fashioned phrase, which is really about the lives of the celebrities, which is not normally known for its satirical content or putting the boot into characters. It's all very sort of lovey, positive stuff, and sort of they're putting the boot in, and then basically it becomes a ridiculous roller coaster into, you've been denounced by the television listings magazines as an individual, the Christian Monitor, it works all the way down to sort of Men's Health and eventually Horse and Hound and Country Life, and all these magazines which are so far away from their niche. The magazines become more and more niche and so far away from it. I haven't described it at all well, but it's such a good standout song that I came away from the piece really liking it. But what I really liked was this one brilliant song. And I like that in Edinburgh, that sometimes you can see a piece which isn't a musical but's got something, a song stands out. Yeah, absolutely. Or there's a really good idea for a song there. It's one of those songs that I think I could have listened to it for a few more minutes. They could have gone further and further into children's comics. You've been upset by Noddy in Toyland comic or something like that. But anyway, forgive me, that's Out to Lunch, which was terribly funny, with one brilliant song. It
sounds like a very dark morality play, given that it is sort of a crime and punishment structure to the story.
Well, actually, more than you know. I don't want to release the ending, but the whole thing then turns on itself again, and a very satisfactory ending, where it looks like actually a kind of denouement is going to be reached, which might unexpectedly pull the cat from the bag for all the parties involved, and then a further turn means it's a disaster for everybody for comic purposes. So, it was very nicely written. I liked it a lot. It'd be interesting, but the thing is, it will be interesting to sort of musicalise properly, and I don't mean that against what they did, but at the moment it's very clearly a comedy play with 4 songs in it, whereas actually you could make it more dynamic musical, with songs, I think.
It sounds like a very interesting and original premise, something I can't really think of anything quite like that. So.
No, nor can I, funnily enough. It is a morality tale, but I tell you what, actually, I suppose it would be, I don't know if an Alfred Hitchcock Presents or a Tales of the Unexpected kind of 30-minute TV thriller with a twist. That's the nearest I think it comes to, but with the songs, there's a payoff and a comeuppance, but it isn't necessarily one you're expecting.
I'll jump in with mention of a more traditional musical. Well, traditional in the number and use of the songs, but perhaps untraditional in many other senses. A show called Julie, which was a historical biomusical, somewhat comedically and exaggeratedly interpreted, of a infamous 17th, I believe, century opera singer, fencer, and all-around adventurer named, and I promise you I'm going to mispronounce this because it's French, Julie d'Aubigné.
I'm not going to correct you.
We'll say that's probably close enough so that people who know who that character is will recognize it. But apologies for any misplaced phonemes. So she was really, you could think of her as an adventurer first, because she went on these travels where all these unlikely episodes would happen, and she was always one step ahead of the law or the wrath of local aristocracy who she'd offended. There's a infamous chapter in her life where she seduced a young nun and ran off with her from her convent, and to cover her tracks, she created a fire and incinerated a corpse of an existing dead nun in hopes that would be discovered and be deemed to be the person who she had absconded with. So hopefully that would set them off their trail. All these adventures, and she stumbles into the world of opera singing and becomes sort of a well-known figure there. And she's a skilled fencer, so she's constantly...
Goodness, she's an amazing woman.
It's a fascinating story, and I think it's come to light with more prominence recently because she was openly and proudly bisexual. So she is perhaps a role model, if not in her actual course of her life, but in terms of her
has now become one, quite.
She's not apologetic.
Yes.
Which, the show is perhaps in the tradition of something like Six, where it's very irreverent, very crossing the fourth wall. It's not quite in concert format, but it's presented in a perhaps spiritually kindred way to that. The music's contemporary, it's bawdy, it's humorous, there's a lot of communion with the audience, and it's very skillfully done. It falls into the category of show where the musicians are actors and vice versa. And once again, they are picking up and putting down this diversity of different instruments, from percussion to folk instruments to contemporary instruments. There's kind of a rock star stylization to the presentation of the main character.
Well, she has a rock star life, really, doesn't she, the way you've described it?
And I think that's the metaphor they're using, and certainly the way that they've presented her. The actors are sometimes wearing the facial makeup that I think was on vogue of the French aristocracy of the time. It's just this continually rolling adventure and going from place to place with daring escapes and defiance of social norms. And that takes a turn for the sincere at the end. And I won't go into details because I want to preserve the impact of the change. But if you think, this is a very far-flung analogy, so approach this with a sort of loose limb spirit. But if you think of what gangster movies had in common, or maybe the movie, the play and movie Amadeus, you have a character with this kind of wild lifestyle who eventually deals with the comeuppance of that lifestyle, sometimes fatally, sometimes in terms of remorse, or perhaps achieving new emotional depth that they didn't seem to have previously, or not in full. And this follows that format. So you wonder, what could a woman who seemingly is indestructible and has everything she wants and is just adventuring her way through life, what does she want? What are her needs? And the show tries to answer that question at the end as well, making it, giving it more dimensionality than had it just been a chronicle of a series of interesting incidents. So the performances are really striking. The comedic skill of the cast, the musical skill of the cast. I think that's honestly the performers and the interpretation are almost what I walked away with more than the story, as exciting and interesting as the story was. So that, I think for those reasons, it's something I can recommend to fringe goers.
That sounds amazing as a piece. And you've often, I've noticed, gravitated towards these rather excellent shows about distinctive women who have, if you like, sort of been able to challenge the limitations of the age would attempt to put on them. So do you remember you did one about a female aviator a few years ago?
Are you thinking of A Gallant Life?
Yes, I think so.
I think she started out as being a historical race car driver.
Maybe I've got the vehicle wrong, sorry.
The same idea, speed and definitely a female hero in a male-dominated field. Going on to play an important support role as an ambulance driver and I think leader of kind of a squad of first aid medics on the Belgian front in World War I. I think there are it's not because I'm predisposed towards female-centric stories. There's just a lot.
One way or the other, yes, for or against.
I think writers are interested in these stories now, and there are a lot of good ones coming out. Just because it's a paradigm we're seeing more and more of. I mean, Six is a prime example of a show that follows this pattern and then achieved success well beyond its Edinburgh Fringe origins.
Yes,
but it's worth remembering that it came from the French.
Yes, it was a modest production to begin with, and then moved right on. I only mentioned the Gallant Life as a comparison because you're right, it's very much part of the cultural literature of the moment, because on British television there's a series called Gentleman Jack, which is telling the story of a real person. Obviously it's been embellished for television and is now extended over a number of series and episodes. So one, like The Crown, you wonder how much of it is actually accurate. But the general thrust is there. But this is the story of an overtly gay female landowner in the 18th century, and it's prime time on television in this country and a big hit. It's not a musical in any way, but you can sort of see it's good that our modern perspective is allowing us to retrieve and capture people of all walks of life and all types who may have been overlooked in the history books. And now I want to do nothing more but look up this Julie character.
She sounds really interesting, and the musical depiction of her was tremendous fun. We touched on earlier, I forget if it was a separate episode or earlier this episode, that's what's happened to my perception of time, but on Dots and Dashes, which was an ensemble piece, but it was, again, women serving quite thanklessly in a very important historical role.
and not losing their humanity in the process. That's the point. They're more than, particularly that one, but the Julie one, you could turn that person into a cartoon kind of adventuress if you wanted to, but you've made it very plain. But there's actually there's a humane element and flavour to it, which is so important in grounding these people. That they're it's easy to romanticise, to use the old-fashioned phrase, someone who's a bigger, larger-than-life extroverted character who's had these amazing adventures. But you have to remember that they'll have had pain in their lives and sadness in their lives and happiness in their lives, and they'll have stubbed their toe, and they'll have they'll have lost their keys one day. All the normal dreary, banal stuff that affects us all.
There was a very deliberate attempt to create an emotional through line in her story, to the point of perhaps embellishing or adding details that might have been outside of the historical narrative. And the show makes no bones about sharing, saying, like, we're going to change. Literally, the character says, I'm going to change this part of the story because it's my story and I want it to go this way. So there's almost a little bit of hyper-reality to the whole thing.
Acknowledged license.
Exactly. Very, very acknowledged. I would say, in terms of romanticizing the past, I would say it's a romanticized presentation, because the characters are stylized so heavily as kind of rock star, larger than life, wearing heels, wearing the accoutrements of punk rock and its successor styles. But it makes an effort to keep this sincere thread throughout all the wild and raucous adventures, and I think that's it's to be commended for that reason, because it could have easily just descended into a series of anecdotes.
I very much wish I'd had a chance to see that. That sounds fabulous.
Well, hopefully you will.
Yes, hopefully I will. That's a very good point.
There's an interesting trend I've noticed in musicals, both at the Fringe and in the indie musical theater development community, and I've seen a number of examples of this here at Fringe, commercially, and back in Los Angeles. And that is what I'll call historically set but contemporarily stylized. How's that for a complicated sentence? Shows that are historically set, but they are stylized in a way that feels modern. Maybe the music is modern, the dress, the apparel, the narrative style is very up to date, the language may be contemporary. We think of Hamilton, and before that we think of Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes,
and
of course.
I think those kicked off the trend, and I think Six continued with that, and perhaps showed how the stylization could be elevated beyond just the musical language and the lyrical language, but to all elements of the production. In Hamilton, in terms of its staging, yes, there was dancing, and presumably that didn't happen during the Revolutionary War quite as much, but the costume design was
just a minuet, surely.
Right, every now and then. But the costume design, it didn't look that different from 1776, for example.
What, the musical?
Right.
Yeah. Because there is a musical.
Well, that's what
you are referring. Yeah, fine. Well, 1776 is such a big part of American conversation. It comes up casually. So.
I know. Sore losers, I get it. But the new trend seems to be also. So we think of this modern tradition. You start with Hamilton, then to Six, where they add this kind of larger than life contemporary framework. The rock concert.
Yeah.
So if we look at the shows that seem to follow in this tradition, there's one other element, which is, I think, frequent fourth wall traversal, perhaps through a narrator. So we've just talked about Julie, we talked about Medea, we've talked about Dots and Dashes. These vary in how over the top they are. Dots and Dashes wasn't quite as elaborate and showy as some of the others. I feel like there's some others. I'm going to scramble to remember if there were some other shows that we saw along these lines. Vote Macbeth. And I'm going to leave out Runesical because that was meant to be sort of a more comedic romp. But all of these seem to follow this trend of revisiting historical subjects with modern sensibilities, either musically or narratively or costume-wise in some way, and trying to make them accessible by making them down to earth. Maybe it's just because the musical style feels very familiar to us. And it's interesting to see how this tradition is really blossoming and spreading out in all traditions.
But here's a question. If you're saying, as I think you are, that actually the point of these musicals is the juxtaposition between contemporary mores and delivery over the historic classic story, then is there a danger that these shows will speech marks date more easily than what one might be called standard musical theatre, whatever that is. But you know what I mean? Something that isn't following that trope, that is actually writing a score for the story it's telling. You know, let's randomly pick a Sondheim, you know, whatever one thinks of Sondheim. You know, Wise Guy is his last show, or Road Trip, or whatever it's called. You know, he wrote the score for that to tell the story for that. It's going to be very Sondheimian. It is very Sondheimian, but it will be remembered as being Sondheimian. But it doesn't date. It only dates in the sense that it's of an era. It's not because it's specifically picking up on the sounds of the era contemporarily. He wasn't writing contemporary music. Six, for example, we know, and I didn't know when I first saw it because I have so little handle on pop music, but actually each of the songs is a terribly good pastiche of a style or singer of the period. I just thought, for me, it was just contemporary modern pop. I wasn't able to differentiate. I wasn't actually able to tell one song from another in terms of its stylistic roots, which is interesting. And of course, I get much less out of Six than a lot of people. If you get that, I can see there's a much greater fun to be had with it and joy. But, you know, if there's an Adele number, that's fine. Adele still has currency. Will Adele have currency in 10 years' time? Will Adele have currency in 40 years' time? You know, will the meaning of the songs or these extra flavours, which I didn't get and therefore didn't make the most of, mean that these shows are going... I mean, 40 years is a long time. But are these shows going to tire and age and date quicker than speech marks standard musical theatre? I don't know if there's an answer to that, but you see, they're clicking themselves so thoroughly into the zeitgeist.
I hear what you're saying. There's an expression in musical theatre that's often associated with book writing that I'm going to steal and try to transplant into music, and that is the specific through the universal. Wait, no, scratch that, reverse it. Yeah. The universal through the specific, and that you can only have a timeless topic by tackling a particular story and all its nuances and details. And when you think about it, like every musical ever written had to be influenced by the music of its era in some way. Jesus Christ Superstar, which we just talked about, feels very much of the kind of late 60s, early 70s rock, funk hybrid of the time. And parts of that score definitely feel like, yep, that's 1971 for you. But the show has something to offer to a level where it's elevated above the details of its era. And I think it's because it's not just relying on the nuances of the music of the time. And I think what we'll find with Hamilton, for example, is, yes, you know, it's steeped as a kind of pan-hip-hop, almost a tribute to hip-hop styles across the history of that particular genre. There's moments that feel more up-to-date. There's moments that feel like they're a throwback to battle raps of the 80s. But I think as time goes on, we're not going to listen to it and go, oh, this is really kind of grating because it feels so cliche. I think we're going to hear that as a historical snapshot of pop styles at the time, but because the story has substance to it, we're not going to experience that as being dated. It will feel like Cole Porter. Does that feel dated? Of course it does. It's, you know, it's music.
It still works,
big
I suppose,
era.
doesn't it? Yeah.
But we don't. There's a difference. All right, let me try to formulate this as a theory, but bear with me because I'm coming up with this on the fly. There's a difference between perceiving music as being era specific and hearing that kind of stinky old milk feeling of a cliche. Right?
Yes.
There's a difference between being of an era and being cliched. And I think the difference is whether the music relies on the conventions of the time or applies those conventions to an original artistic idea. And I think with Hamilton, I think the test of time will say that, yeah, it's hip-hop, it's a lot of hip-hop tropes, but there was such originality here that it's going to become timeless and like a snapshot of a musical tradition in that era. And I think the best of these new shows will also have that quality.
Well, I'm going to agree with you, and I'm going to do it by agreeing and then taking us right back 150 years. Because actually, at the moment I started saying the question, I also realised I knew the answer from the world of Gilbert and Sullivan. You know, what everybody who was Victorian knew about Sullivan, and almost nobody today knows about Sullivan, is that he was a great classical music pasticher, to use a broad term, and a lot of, particularly his earlier GNSs, riffing very firmly on Haydn and Purcell and various other composers that he particularly liked. And Victorian audiences guffawed their way through much of the musical pastiching as they saw it, completely lost to 90% of the people who still like Gilbert and Sullivan today, just because we're not Victorian and we don't have that understanding of the music in quite the same way. And certainly I don't have that kind of knowledge at my fingertips. So I enjoy Sullivan because Sullivan to me sounds just like this composer called Sullivan. He sounds like himself. I don't get any of the resonances with other composers. So I suppose you're right. Let's translate that back, let's travel forward 150 years. 6 is going to be the same thing. People won't necessarily recognise that this is an Adele spoof, this particular song or whatever, in 100 years' time if it's still being performed. But they'll recognise the overall sound as being of its period, and as you say, the strength of the story. And let's be honest, the story of the 6 Wives of Henry VIII is likely to persist as it already has. You're right. It is going to survive. So forgive me. It's interesting to hear what you said, and then also have the answer printed out for me already in one sense, because this happened 150 years ago.
And so much more of a classy manner than my formulation. But
No. And besides, if you don't mind me saying, it's we bring different things to the table, and yet we bring the same things to the table in different ways, and therefore all illumination is offered.
Right, the universal through the specific once again.
Oh, I'm liking. Mike, as always, fantastic to talk to you. Thank you so much. You've brought illumination where there was previously darkness, he said, semi-quoting the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi in a strange segue at the very end of this. But seriously, thank you for talking to Musical Talk again, but more importantly, it was just so lovely to see you in Edinburgh and then here again in London to discuss it all. Let's do it again soon.
That sounds like a plan.
Musical Talk. And there we are, Michael Gordon Shapiro, who cannot be described as the crotchety uncle of musical theatre, because the man is quite uncle-like, but in the proper sense, the proper adjective, which is avuncular. There is almost no one more avuncular than Michael Gordon Shapiro, and I'm pleased to call him a friend and a colleague. And I hope that you've enjoyed listening to him and me talking about those 5 shows that you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. In reverse order: Julie, Out to Lunch, La Serva Padrona, the Queens Cartoonists, and Runesical. Now, the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year was a magnificent return to form, and I've said it before and I'm saying it again. It was so wonderful to be back there, and that was very much the atmosphere that everyone who went there felt, whether they be performer or audience member. So over the next few weeks and months we're going to continue our coverage, but not exclusively. There'll be episodes in which we look at individual musicals in depth with conversations that I had with some of the creators behind them, and I hope that you'll find them interesting. But we've interspersed them with other episodes about other subjects, so it's not exclusively about the Fringe here on Musical Talk, but the Fringe is the source of brand new musicals, and they very often go on to somewhere else, sometimes amazing places. And if you don't believe me, you only have to remember 6, which started off as a very modest show at Edinburgh and made its way to Broadway. So the shows we're talking about here on Musical Talk can sometimes go on to have amazing legacies, and allows you to say, we heard it here first. But you're not going to hear very much more after this, because I'm going to stop talking for this episode in literally just a few seconds. And as we count those seconds down, I'm sure you'll join me. 5, 4, 3, 1. I've left out 2. What a shame. Never mind. Let's carry on. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos and Mike Shapiro, and edited by Thos. Although I would like to extend my thanks to Mike for some of his technical assistance in cleaning up these recordings. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. So we'll start with Runesical, we'll go on to the Serva Padrona, and then we'll mop up.
Wait, I've looked for an excuse to use this expression. Bits and bobs, yes.
Is that not an American phrase?
It's the most exotic thing I've heard in my life.
Well, fine, let us do the bits and bobs.
Or we would say whatnot. that's our equivalent.
Well, interesting, a whatnot is a piece of furniture in this country. Very uncommon these days, but it's usually a kind of sort of corner piece where you've got an unused corner and you can't use it, and it's a kind of corner stand for ornaments.
So there's a
and you put your thingamabobs on the whatnot.
So there's a semantic overlap in that both seem to deal with things that didn't fall in the main categories.
Yeah, it's detritus, I suppose, actually, yeah.
Right.
So a whatnot for us is a cabinet. Yeah,
So I've never heard that used in that sense. Two nations divided by a common language.
was that Churchill?
I think so.
Yeah, he was quite right there, I think.
We'll call it continuum. Maybe
Yeah.
there's ways to have varying degrees of both. But to me, this felt like a sincere. I hope nobody was a shot of a laser.
I think Star Wars has arrived.
Yeah, are we getting our bona fides checked out? We're in this fancy club for those of you listening. So what was it? All right, so
Once again, to roll it back again, I think there are some flavours once again that you. I'm going to have to say. I've said once again once too often.
you said it once again.
Yeah.